All right, so let me begin the presentation. Baoqi and I will be speaking in turn. The title of our presentation today is The Impact of Technology Use on Students' Independent Reading Habits and Practices. I'd just like to emphasize that we're using the word technology use, and that, actually when you think about technology, print is of course a form of technology for reading as well. But by technology here, we wanted to include stuff such as devices, from your laptops to your computers to your phones. These are all devices that we use, but it also includes subscriptions and things that may distract as well as contribute to reading. Why independent reading? So the word independent reading is often used. Sometimes words such as extensive reading, reading for pleasure, leisure reading are used. But the reason why we wanted to use independent reading was we wanted to emphasize on the independent, the fact that the children and the adolescents who are in our secondary schools actually choose to do the reading themselves. It may include reading for pleasure. It may include reading to learn. And very often we found in our interviews with children, especially the older kids, that reading to learn and reading for pleasure often go hand in hand when they're reading something that they like. And the other reason that we wanted to use the term independent reading, because we wanted to recognize that in school, there isn't a lot of time for students to do independent reading, where they choose the books to read. So it's an important element to focus on. So why independent reading? Teresa has touched on some of that, but basically the research tells us that if you read more and you enjoy reading, there is a link to traditional reading proficiency. It's tied to academic achievement, but more importantly, in light of our move sort of general direction towards lifelong learning, when you enjoy reading, you are generally a self-directed reader who will use reading to improve and to learn more. More importantly, again, is that reading is correlated to well-being. We find there is research that tells us that children read and adolescents read to enjoy themselves and to feel relaxed. That's an unusual word, but sometimes we hear the girls and boys use it. They say they read to relax. So it's something that makes them feel good. At the same time, even as we are moving into sort of digital literacies, I think it is important to note that this reading enjoyment is tied to digital reading proficiencies, as well as the deep, sustained reading that we want students to have. So the research context for this, in 2017, Baoqi and I, together with a few other co-PIs with MOE and NLB, started on a Building a Reading Culture project. And as part of that study, we did surveys with 6 schools, and we also looked at their school library and their reading culture. And this report on the reading habits of Singapore teenagers was published in 2018 from the 2017 survey. From that survey and from that study, 2 other studies emerged. So Baoqi is PI of the first study, Leisure Reading in 2 Languages. This is done in primary school with about 8 primary schools, and she administered the survey to about 4,000 students from these 8 schools between August to October 2020. She also conducted focus groups with 36 primary 4 students from 1 school. I mean, it's important to note that these studies were actually done after the COVID-19 circuit breaker last year. So I think in terms of technology at that point in time, our students had exposure to a lot more technology than they had in 2017 when we did our first survey. Now, as part of this current Designing School Libraries of the Future study, where we're working with 3 schools on their future-ready school libraries, we wanted to do a reading trend analysis. We administered the survey to 7 schools, but for the purposes of today's presentation, we removed a single gendered school so that the gender would be evenly represented. So we have just below 6,000 survey responses from 6 schools between March to April 2021 this year. And again, a focus group was done with 37 secondary 2 and 3 students from 1 case study school. Moving on to Baoqi.
Here are some results for our children from primary 3 to secondary 4. The first graph shows us the changes of reading enjoyment. As we can see, P3 and P4 children reported the highest level of reading enjoyment, and then it goes all the way down to secondary 3. And bounce back a little bit in secondary 4. There's no simple reason for this pattern, and I believe all of you may have your own reasons. We can talk more later in our breakout rooms. For now, at least it highlights that reading enjoyment is not static, and we cannot rest even after our children can read on their own. The second graph shows us the changes of self-reported reading proficiency. Similarly, we see the number goes down across 3 levels. This may be due to the increased requirement for academic language proficiency as children progress. The third graph is about children's reading frequency. No exception, we see them reading less often from primary to secondary, with P4 being the most frequent readers. However, the pattern is not always downward. Let's look at the last graph, which is about their reading duration. Compared to younger students, older ones actually read for longer sessions. One possible reason may be that older children have more experiences with language and a longer attention span. Therefore, they are able to read longer. However, they may not read as often due to various reasons. Again, we can discuss more about this reason later on. Taken together, these 4 graphs shows us that children's independent reading is a very complex topic. We cannot, reading should be monitored. Children's reading enjoyment and reading habits should be monitored closely and promoted from time to time with different strategies catered to different age groups. And now let's look at number of books. Books at home is a very important reading resource. So before we see the results, I'm wondering how many books do you think our children should have at home? Okay, stay with the numbers. Here are our results. So let's start with the dark blue section. 23% of our participants, both primary and secondary, have no more than 10 books at home, and another 20% of them own 11 to 20 books at home. So altogether, about 40% of our participants have fewer than 20 books at home, which is not much. On the other hand, when we look at the yellow and the light blue sections, about 34 of them have more than 50 books at home. Well, friends, school and public libraries can provide access to more reading resources to all children. Children with fewer books at home benefit from regular access to reading resources in school. The next graph, this graph shows the comparison of number of books owned by children who are on FAS and who are not. FAS refers to financial assistance. As shown, 40% of FAS children have 10 or fewer books at home, whereas for their peers who are not on FAS, about 1/3 of them have more than 50 books at home. Children with more books at home are more likely to have access to reading materials and vice versa. This may be more of a concern with the current pandemic situation, as we spend more time at home and sometimes school libraries, public libraries are closed. As we can see in the next slides, number of books at home and reading enjoyment are highly related. So this graph shows the relationship between the number of books and reading enjoyment. We categorize the participants by the number of books they own at home. The first column on our left represents those who have fewer than 10 books, and the second column stands for those with 11 to 20 books, and the rest columns represent more books. Within each column, the different color blocks represent their reading enjoyment level. The dark blue block is about enjoy reading very much. The light blue block is enjoy reading quite a lot. The gray block is somewhat, and the orange and the red blocks represent enjoy reading a little bit or not at all. As we can see, the color blocks showed very clear patterns. For students who own more books, more of them reported they enjoy reading very much. On the other hand, for students who own fewer books at home, more of them indicated they do not enjoy reading at all or a little bit. So across all the columns, we also notice there's a large proportions of students who are in the gray blocks. It is possible that given the right circumstances and the books, they may take to reading. So far, we have focused on their access to print books. Then how about their access to digital resources? Chin-Yi, please.
Yep, so for access to digital resources, we only look at secondary schools. So we asked the secondary 1 to 4 students about their digital access. So if you look, actually, our teenagers in Singapore have pretty high connectivity. 99.1% say they have internet connection at home, and 95.5% state that they have an individual phone plan with internet access. Of course, what we didn't do is we didn't ask them what kind of internet access, how much subscription do you have, how many hours or megabytes do you have on your phone. The other thing to consider was that some of the schools reported to us that some students may not have done the survey because they didn't have a phone with mobile access when they were out of the house, or they didn't have a phone at all. So it's possible that this data is over-reported. But I think whatever it is, we need to note the excess of students who do not have access to this, even if the internet access and access to devices is high. The second thing we asked them was whether they had smartphones, e-readers, tablets, and a computer or a laptop. What is interesting in this data is that if you look at the section under smartphone highlighted in red, 95.2% of them have their own individual smartphone. So that reflects what you saw in the earlier data. The other thing that was interesting was that 81.1% did not have an e-reader. So with e-readers, we mean things like Kindles or Kobos, where it's a dedicated reading device. So most students don't have e-readers. Fewer students have tablets and more students have computer or laptops. And of course, these numbers will change because in July 2021, all secondary school students will have their own personal learning devices. I think what is important for us in terms of the research is to consider what do we want to have on these personal learning devices? How can we facilitate students reading, whether in print or on these devices? So let's talk about the impact of technology on reading, which is the main focus of today's presentation. Baoqi, please.
Okay, so in our surveys, we also asked the participants to rank their preferred reading devices, in which print is also included. So as we can see, print is the most preferred reading device from P3 until secondary 1, and then smartphone takes over. This may be because that primary school children are less likely to have smartphones of their own, whereas smartphone is a must-have for teenagers to complete their schoolworks. Computers and the tablets are ranked after print and smartphone. Interestingly, e-reader, which is the only electronic device designed for reading, is the least preferred reading device. Based on our previous question about device ownership, this may be because that students are less likely to have an e-reader. So clearly, devices are going to coexist with print when children grow older. And most devices also have entertainment functions. Hence, one question arises: what are children's reason for reading in print and on devices? Now let's look at some focus group data. So in these slides, this is from our last year's primary school HBL study. Some primary school children in the focus group share some of their reasons. Let's take 1 minute to read. Okay, I hope you have done. So this section is quite informative. It demonstrates children's lack of familiarity with technology for reading. For instance, the students 2 and 3, they mentioned 2 common challenges for digital reading. One is the difficulty in searching for reading materials of their interest, and the other is to get free access to such resources. They prefer to looking for physical books in the library because they are used to it, as they're more familiar with the process of this kind of process. In contrast, the internet is not very user-friendly compared to public libraries in terms of obtaining such books. More importantly, our digital natives are more familiar with using devices for functions other than reading, such as playing games and browsing popular apps. These entertainment resources are very easy to navigate and highly engaging. In the case of student 1, which is a boy, he believed smartphones were designed for games only, and consequently, he used his phone for games only. So now let's look at teenagers' data. So here are some reasons provided by the teenagers in our focus group. So as we can see, there are similar reasons, such as it is tired to the eyes, and students get easily distracted regarding reading digitally. However, there are also reasons are different from primary school children, such as the second student. This student is self-declared avid reader. He or she appears to be very familiar with how to locate e-books online and thinks reading digitally is more convenient compared to reading in print. Okay, in our last year's HBL study, we found that about 60% of our children spend more time on devices. This is maybe due to more access to devices and more time at home. This table shows us the correlations between the changes of time on devices and the children's reading enjoyment and reading amount changes. In the first two numbers, it's highlighted in yellow. It shows that the changes of time on devices is negatively correlated with children's reading enjoyment before HBL and reading enjoyment changes during HBL. That is, for children who enjoy reading before HBL, they are more likely to spend less time on devices during HBL. And for children who spend more time on devices, they are more likely to enjoy reading less during HBL, and vice versa. Moreover, the other two numbers shows us the changes of time spent on devices was not correlated with the changes in reading amount in both print and digital formats. Taken together, these results suggest that spending more time on devices is negatively correlated to children's reading enjoyment, and having access to devices may not lead to more reading in digital format naturally. So when we talk to the children in the focus group on this, they share the following results. So please note for the last quote, there appears to be some device control rules in the household, as the child was only allowed to use iPad on Sunday and Saturdays. However, when the child had the iPad, he or she did not read at all. So in these slides, we are reporting results from a recent survey with teenagers. We look at the relationships between their reading habits and leisure activities. This table shows 5 leisure activities, reading and 4 other device-related activities. Of course, the frequency of reading as a leisure activity is highly correlated with reading enjoyment, reading frequency, and reading duration. On the other hand, the 4 device-related leisure activities, they were negatively correlated with reading enjoyment, duration, and the frequency. So this result suggests that device use may conflict with leisure reading. Here are some quotes from our focus group. So the first student share with us, reading is something that students choose to do, or when she or he feel really boring or the phone was taken away. The second student share with us, he or she used phone for reading after he or she own her own phone. And the last one shows that the student knew about library app, but time is an issue in terms of using it. So what do they read on their devices? Jenny, please.
Okay, so moving on, looking at Sec 1 to 4, we asked students what they prefer to read on their devices. So if you look at this graph over here, blue is for the students who enjoy reading, and red is for the students who do not enjoy reading at all. And these are the top 5 things they read on their smartphones. So you can see they are social media posts, fan fiction, discussion websites, news articles, as well as personal essays. I think what is interesting to note is that if you look at the social media posts, they're quite similar. There's not that much of a difference, but other reading materials such as fan fiction, discussion website, news articles, as well as personal essays, actually it is the readers who enjoy reading more of these on their phones as well. So actually that supports what we've seen in research. There is a recent article, well, not so recent, but 2017 article by Norton and Beck, where they talk about reading enjoyment correlated to students' digital literacy. So I think you can see a little bit of that, where the students who actually enjoy reading, they're actually reading what you might see as longer articles online. What I think is interesting to note also is how students are reading information. So as this student says, he reads the news, but he just browses through. I think so there's a lot of skimming and scanning that's happening online. Students are also getting their news from online platforms such as Mothership or Straits Times. So a lot of the papers are being sent to them. So I think as we consider how students are reading online, we need to consider how they're reading the news as well. How are they getting the information? Is it through social media groups? Or do they know how to look for different sources of media and different information on different sites? Finally, this is from a student who says that she's an avid reader, and she says that on her phone and laptop, she would go to Wattpad, which is a fan fiction site. And what is interesting here is, of course, she's using one form of social media like Pinterest. And from there, she discovers books that she's interested in. She discovers there's this thing called fan fiction, and she goes on to Wattpad and explores the reading there. Another question that we ask is to ask students what they would use more. So if you look at this, students who enjoy reading are more likely to also use technology for reading. So in other words, your use of technology actually supports your reading habits. If you look at this quote by the side, this comes from an avid boy reader who says that he actually prefers to read online. He uses the NLB app quite often. And as you can see there, this is how he's using the NLB app. He goes to the bookstore, uses it as a browsing section, kind of looks at the books and then borrows it on the NLB app. So he knows how to make use of resources to extend his reading habits. Another avid reader says that she would like to go online and basically look at TikTok. And again, you see the connection, the whole ecology of reading, where she's looking at TikTok, Instagram, and different social media sites to actually support her own reading and her finding of books. What I think we found was interesting, if you look at the data here, is that students don't actually know how to find books online. Not all. Those who are good readers, who enjoy reading, have made the extra effort because it's something they enjoy. Pretty much like if I enjoy soccer, I'll, find time to go out to play, but I don't, okay? But, I like reading, so I make the effort to find books that I like. But if you look at the first quote, that's from a primary 4 student. He can't find a book that is of the appropriate level online. So that's a skill that is required to find a book that's appropriate for you. Same thing in secondary school, where this student says, well, she just couldn't find the right book and so decided to wait for the hard copy. Finally, about e-devices, again, e-readers. What was really interesting in the survey was that, of course, we know that not many students had things such as Kindles, but just because somebody has a Kindle doesn't mean it's well used. And I think this reminds us that when we think about reading, we need to think about the ecosystem of reading. Because unless you have a subscription, books are not free on Kindle. You have to buy the books. And this particular student who has given this quote basically has only read all of Harry Potter on her Kindle because her parents did not have the time to download books for her after that. So in a sense, that device is no longer used. Just as a side note, I recently bought a Kobo for my son because I can use it to borrow NLB books. So that's a different reading device. But all these devices are expensive. And why don't I use a tablet? Because I can't monitor what he's doing on the tablet. Did I just put that out in public? Okay. Anyway, we also asked teens what they want for their school libraries. Okay. And this is really interesting because in 2017, we asked the same question and we had the same results. Overwhelmingly, students made book-related requests for more books, better books, greater variety of books, and greater ease of finding books. I'm going to just put the quotes on the side for you to look at as I talk through it. But if you look at it, you do see the word more coming up very often. They want books that are more relevant to them. They want more books. What is interesting in the second quote is that they want more things to look forward to. So this was interesting because these are students talking about reading programs. You know, they want the library to be an exciting place, not a once-off program, but for things to be regularly happening. What we've found in the one case study school where we did the interviews in was that it was interesting that students actually said they would go to the library when they were in Sec 1 and they would find a new genre that they haven't discovered. But after that, if their library didn't have the book, they might then go to the public library to look for that. So the library can be a place of discovery, but first there needs to be books for students to discover the books. So what are the implications? I think the core of it is this: we want to develop engaged readers who gain pleasure from their reading and learning and are confident in their learning. And in order to support students engage reading or reading for pleasure, as Teresa called it, it requires a whole school approach to insert an ecological and deliberate attempt into the daily routine of children and adolescents. And I think the word routine and ecological and deliberate, these three words are really important. So how can we help students to cultivate habits of engaged reading? These four words at least came out when we were looking through the data. What we found was that students needed help with searching for books, finding books. We must not assume that students know how to find books. And I think this connects very well with what Teresa was saying about how, you know, teachers need to be able to help students to find the right books. If you talk to avid readers, they have been socialized into looking for the right book. So they're very independent in finding what they want to read. But for kids who may not come from that sort of home background, school becomes a very important place to support them. The second thing is that socialization is very important, as Baoqi has mentioned. In order to socialize anybody into anything, there needs to be a habit, there needs to be a routine. And then we need to scaffold. We need to scaffold because there are some kids who can read difficult books, some kids who can read easy books, some kids who can find books, some kids who can't. But we need to help all of them become better readers and enjoy reading more. And we need to do it step by step. And finally, for schools, I think we need to sustain. It's not a once-off, you know, I renovate my library so it looks really attractive and that's the end of it. But what are all the things that we're going to do across the year in order to sustain that culture? So maybe just to end with kind of 5 suggestions, I think there are a lot more implications we can talk about, but in light of sort of us moving into having the personal learning devices, there were some thoughts that we had for blended learning and reading. I think one important thing is to provide age-appropriate and high-interest print books for students to bring home. Okay, so just because students are going to be at home, we don't want them to be staring at the screen all the time. So if they have books at home, that would be great. Okay, and you know, a rotating, you know, when they go home, they would bring a new set each time, right? Spend time on book recommendations and read aloud to scaffold students' reading choices. I think this can be done in secondary school too. Put aside time to socialize students into reading both print and ebooks, meaning you teach them how to use the app. But after you teach them how to use the app, you give them time to use, for example, the NLB app and the Libby app in class. And with that, you teach them to look for books as well. So there are a lot of things to look into. And finally, perhaps we can integrate reading activities into schools' online curriculum and programs. So thank you very much, everyone. I hope this gives us some thought for discussion.